And with that, we shall go ahead and get started. So, welcome everyone. This is Accessible Graphic Design, hosted by the statewide IT Access Initiative under the Maryland Department of Disabilities. My name is Stephen Polacek. I am the IT Accessibility Evaluator here. Just a couple things before we get into this. First off, we have closed captioning available, so please, if you so desire, you can turn it on from the ribbon menu at the bottom of your screen. The second thing, I do ask that everyone holds their questions until the end of today's presentation, both just to make things a little bit easier and to make sure that we get through everything in time. If needs be, if we still have questions by the time we hit 2 o'clock, I'll still be available for about 10 to 15 minutes afterwards that I can continue to answer questions. Last thing, we are recording this webinar and it will be posted on our YouTube channel probably within the next day or so. And I'll be sending that link out along with the slide deck to everyone afterwards. So you will have all the material and the links here that we're talking about today. With that, let us go ahead and move on. So today's objectives are, we want to first off figure out how to incorporate accessibility into your workflow. One of the most common things we come across is people, they want to make their content accessible, but having to try and do it after the fact, after they've already generated their document or their product, and then trying to make it accessible after the fact is a lot more difficult than using the tools that are available to you to make something accessible from the get-go, or at least make the process easier. So that's our main goal today, is what tools do you have at your fingertips that you can use to start this process so you don't have to take extra time to do this. The second thing is, how do you make that remediation easier without sacrificing your creativity? What are the very important things that you have to do to make something accessible? And what can you do to still have those really stylized elements like text on a color background, but still make it accessible in remediation when sometimes Acrobat will do this thing where it'll move that behind the color block while it's trying to tag it. We'll try and find solutions to those. And then finally, find some solutions to common issues that occur throughout this process. We are dealing with a more complex thing. It's kind of tricky compared to just regular text documents. So sometimes we have to get a little creative with how we approach this. Sometimes it's creating an invisible box to the side that a screen reader will read because we can't tag the actual element on screen. So we have to find a workaround. So those are the kind of things we're going to discuss today. To start off, our philosophy and approach. Why are we doing this? What is the point? So the first thing we should think about is, how do we communicate ideas while we're using primarily visual concepts? When we're using like color and space in order to draw people's attention to certain topics and such, how do we get that same intensity across through someone who can't see color or can't see at all? So that is how we want to reinforce those ideas without relying totally on those concepts. What do we need to think about while we're designing a document? Who is our audience? What are they supposed to take away from this? And what are their needs? In terms of color blindness, we need to make sure that there's high enough contrast, that kind of thing, making sure that they're able to read the text. And then finally, the most important point, which I already said, but I'm going to say it again, is, what is our audience supposed to take away from this document? And if let's say you're creating a flyer for an event, what are the most important things? When that event is happening, what is it? How do they sign up for it? And how do they get to it? And price, if there is one. How do we make sure all that information is available to everyone involved when you're creating this document and for multiple formats? Sometimes that's making sure that the text is high enough contrast while the outside elements are more to your design. Sometimes that's putting that, creating that in a separate way rather than incorporating it into a single element. There's a number of ways to do this, but we want to make sure that all that critical information is available to everyone in some manner. So let's start from the ground up, the basics of your document. First off, when you're first creating this document, you have to create a file name. As soon as you load up Illustrator, InDesign, whatever you're using, hit Control S, save the document. Make sure that you use a descriptive name for the file. That's because that's going to be the thing a screen reader or other assistive technology goes to first, if there is no title or description. The title and description are best, so if possible, add those in. That's one of those things that's going to be later in the process rather than early on. But if you're providing any of these files to the public in some manner, you need to use a descriptive name in the file as your safety net for this. Margins and bleed marks, I only mention these here because the consistency of these should affect accessibility. I see someone has raised their hand. Okay. Would you prefer to use chat or do you, well, I'll just, here. You can talk, please, Margaret. I just want to make sure this isn't a technical problem. Okay. Margaret, if you have a question just regarding the content, please add it into the chat or we can discuss it at the end. For now, though, I'm going to continue. And if this is a technical issue, please lower and raise your hand again for me. Okay, thank you. So with margins and bleed marks, these primarily should not affect your accessibility concerns, but I do mention it because you want to be consistent with what you're doing with it, because at least in the case of margins, sometimes that can affect things like reading order or how things are interpreted by Adobe Acrobat if you're working with PDFs and you send it over there and it has to tag any extra information, the margins might interfere with that. So just be consistent with it. Make sure you know what you're doing with those, especially if you're doing anything with like switching from portrait to landscape layout, just because it potentially could impact. And as long as you're being consistent with how it is, it shouldn't affect accessibility at all. And then finally, with PDF compatibility, making sure that you choose the correct export option. So all this work that we're going to discuss about other programs, you don't throw away, because there are plenty of times when you export to PDF, but if you don't check that little checkbox that says tagged PDF, it's not going to come out right. It's not going to come out as an accessible document, and you've wasted all that effort. So you want to make sure that you're going along with that. Okay. So text accessibility. This is kind of our first point in the document. What are we doing with text? Now, we want to consider things like the font type, the size, the spacing of it. Sometimes there's some differences between the print needs and digital needs. So how do we address those? And then finally, styles and headings. I have a couple examples on screen. The first one is the stylized script, which is a word art that is in a style that is very cursive, and it has a mirror shadow effect below it. That's kind of showing differences with color and how sometimes that mirroring can cause things, and then the very cursive style can maybe change how people interpret it. Tight spacing versus wide spacing, so like things like kerning and such. These are the two kind of extreme examples you can do in PowerPoint of the tightest spacing, where the letters are pretty much jammed up right against each other, and then wide spacing where they have significant space across from them. That can affect things like dyslexia and such, how people are able to read those. And then headings and paragraphs, which we talk a lot about in our document accessibility webinar. So I'm not going to touch on them too much here, but having those available and making sure that they're not just looking like headings, but they're actually acting like headings. So some quick guidelines regarding font. First off, choose a font that has very easily distinguishable characters. Um, things like lowercase l on capital I, or lowercase o and a 0, which are the two examples I have in the slide deck here. The font here, they're almost indistinguishable from each other unless you get really zoomed in and start focusing on them. Now, context can help a lot with that. An O or a 0 in a string of numbers, like a phone number, an address, zip code, people are going to assume is a number. But if you're using it for an event name or something, make sure that that's distinguishable so people are reading it as what you want them to do. That's more important than sans serif or serif choices. That is something I come across during my research for this, is things like dyslexia and such. There's arguments for both sides, whether a sans serif or a serif font are better for those kinds of disabilities, and it's kind of inconclusive regarding which is better. So it's much more important just to focus on being able to actually distinguish those characters from each other. That's the same reason you want to make sure that your spacing is sufficient enough that you can determine, that I from the L or the N next to it or something. Some good reference points to work off of is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are kind of this governing body of standards internationally agreed on as to these kind of form our baseline for accessibility, at least in a testable method. The 2.0 standards reference 14-point bold font or 18-point regular font as large print. So that's your large print standard. Now, that doesn't mean if you're going below that, you need to just make sure that people are able to interact with it in some manner, or you have that information available in another method. But that kind of gives you that reference point of what is considered large print. If I can do large print on everything, I don't need to worry about this particular accessibility standard. If you're working in pixels though, or another unit of measurement, just make sure that you're converting it correctly. I know Illustrator is able to do that automatically for you, so just be aware of, here's your two reference points for large print and anything beyond that. This is, again, like everything else, or most everything else we're talking about today, is affected by context. If you're sending this to the printer and it's just going to be a big banner in your welcoming space for your event, well, okay, yeah, large print at a 5 foot by 8 foot sign isn't really mean anything. But if you're making this available on your website as like a flyer or an image bar above a form or something, well, then you want to make sure that people are able to either read the image or they have alt text that gives them the same information there. In terms of things like kerning and leading and spacing, you can look at the WCAG 2.1 standards. It has ratios there you can use. For example, line height. They recommend that it should be 1.5 times your font size. So that large print, 18-point regular font, your line height should be 27. Sorry, math. It took me a minute there. Or the 14-point bold font should be 21-point line height. So things like that can give you guidelines as to what's too much, what's too little in terms of things like spacing or font size and relative boundaries. The links there will go directly to those lines there. As I said, those will be in the slide deck when they come out to you guys in a couple days. So you'll have these references available to use. Styles and headings. So the big thing here is you want to use the presets. Now, the presets in some cases, like if you're using Microsoft Office, I am not a graphics designer. I should clarify this now. And I know graphics designers I've worked with in the past, abhor anyone mentioning Microsoft Office in any capacity regarding graphics design, but I feel it's still important to bring up for those people who are creating any kind of documents or flyers in these programs, because these presets give those accessibility tags that a screen reader or other assistive technology needs in order to interpret it correctly. As if you don't use those, either everything just reads as text or it's not read at all. So we want to make sure that we're using those. Now you can adjust those to fit your desired look after you've applied it. You just need to make sure that you click that button. In the case of something like InDesign, though, it's either something you have to create yourself using the style, paragraph styles menu. We'll talk about that later. Or it's something you have to do later in the process because whatever tool you're using isn't able to do it. Most of what we're talking about you can still do in Acrobat Pro and after the fact once you've already generated the PDF, but the more you can do during this step, the less you have to do during that step, and the less tricky it should be. Some differences between print and digital requirements. Printers typically work, now I'm talking like larger scale printers handling, printing companies that are handling thousands upon thousands of documents, not your little home printer for office work. Most of these will work with CMYK color values. They also need the text and shapes in an outline format or vector format. So that means that that text is split out into separate letters that are made into separate shapes. So it's no longer considered a single entity, it's considered multiple entities. Like the word text will instead be 4 pictures instead of 1 for a print version. You also need to provide any referenced or linked files. If you're using any non-standard fonts, you need to provide that font package, that kind of thing. Unless you embed it in the file itself, but kind of the same idea there. Digital needs, though, typically that's working more with RGB or hex color values. Now, most of these programs will handle that conversion for you, but I would still recommend you double checking it because it's not 100% conversion, and that can sometimes affect things like color blindness and such. We want everything to stay in text fields and single shapes. So, any like vector images or such, we want to try and compress into a single layer, or we want to import it, export it so that it's a single entity. Any text in the flyer or document needs to remain in those separate fields so that other programs still interpret them as text. In the case of like creating those outlines or vectors in print, when you send that out to a PDF, a screen reader is not going to be able to interpret those correctly because it's going to either interpret them as single letters, or it's going to try and put a couple of them together because its tagging, auto tagging system is somewhat smart, but it's not smart enough to always get everything together in the right order. And then making sure again that we're using those programmatically associated styles so that those tags and such are coming out so the screen readers can interpret them. This usually, unfortunately, leads you into creating 2 separate versions of your document, one for print and one for digital. I would recommend starting in like almost a mix where you start with CMYK and then you starting with text text fields and vectors and such, but then once it's starting to look like it's ready to go, then you start diverting because then you can do the final conversions of vectors to single elements or color to CMYK to RGB or what have you, and that'll help you keep the same look but being able to satisfy those digital needs for accessibility and also whatever printing company you use, their needs in order to actually print out your document for you. Color guidelines. So CMYK to RGB hex conversion, W3C has a color converter you can use. There's several others available online. Illustrator and InDesign, I think, can handle this to some degree as well. Just recommend that you use something like that in order to check the document. at least the major points like text on any text on its background, because that's kind of where we're most concerned about. For contrast, the minimum standard WCAG 2.0 AA and Section 508, and then if you're in Maryland, the non-visual access clause, those all point to 4.5 to 1 ratio. These are all the ones that are required by law for most content. Sorry, I should rephrase this. So the WCAG 2.0 minimum standards are referenced by Section 508, so the US federal standard, and then if you're in Maryland, the non-visual access clause also references them. So those are the ones written into law. That minimum contrast ratio is 4.5 to 1 for most content, and then 3 to 1 for large print. So if you're using that 14-point bold font or 18-point regular font or larger, you just need to hit 3 to 1 contrast ratio. Now, branding specifically is exempt from this. So things like your logo and such, any text in there is not required to hit this contrast minimum. It's more important for any information that's being delivered on the document. So if you are doing, like, again, that flyer for an event, making sure that that important announcement of where it is and how to sign up for it and what it's going to cost, that text, making sure that that has enough high enough contrast ratio to the text behind it or to the background behind it, so that people with color blindness or low vision are able to read it. Everything else on your flyer, the decorative elements and such, are not as important for this kind of thing. It really comes down mostly to making sure that the information that a person without a disability is getting is being sent or is the same for those with a disability. The third thing here with the guidelines is Adobe has a color contrast analyzer you can use. I'll be showing you it in a minute, but it has a way for you to upload your file or upload a graphic and set up color palettes and such and check if that meets standards. I do want to point out Illustrator, if you're using it, does have a colorblind mode in the view proof menu, but it only covers the two most common red-green types of color blindness. So honestly, you're probably better off using the color contrast analyzer online, which let's get into. So this is what it looks like. It's available from color.adobe.com. I'm just going to put this in the chat for everyone. Oop, that was to the host and panelists. I want that to go to everyone. There we go. So there you are. So what this tool does is it allows you to check how you move these around and choose like a color thing, and it'll tell you there's no color conflicts here for those who are colorblind. It also below you shows the color simulators for those with the two common types of red-green, and also the blue-yellow type tryptopia. So you can kind of see how your document, or at least your color palette, is going to look here through those three main filters. So those are the most common filters you're going to find. So that kind of gives you at least an idea of it. The bigger thing is that it does point out to you here, but like I can like drag this down here, and then I can cause, okay, A and C are now in conflict, so I need to move this to make it more distinct and safe. The nice thing about it too is that, like I said, you can put an image here and it'll pull out a color palette for you. You can also do a gradient from it as well. So it is able to pull out the colors you're working with and see if they're going to be sufficient for your needs. They also have this color wheel for you with the different color modes. If you are working with RGB, it's CMYK, HSB, and I don't know what lab is, but it also offers that. You can enter these and set them to what you want. You can also work with color harmony, which I don't know much about, but those of you who are graphics designers you have this set of tools also to help you with it. The other thing that it offers is this contrast checker. Now, I do want to mention, well, you can also import colors into this to help you with this, or you can just enter them manually. But the main thing I want to point out here is there's two standards it points you to. Now, it references WCAG 2.1. The AA standard is the same as the 2.0 standard, that 4.5 to 1 ratio or 3 to 1 ratio. The AAA standard is pushing you to meet 7 to 1 contrast ratio. So if you want to go above and beyond and be an example of accessibility, you can try and meet that AAA standard. But that means we have to try and raise this contrast ratio even higher. Because as you notice, it's saying we fail for 17 point below, but we're passing for large text, which is that, again, 18 point or 14 point bold. It also helps with things like icons and graphics or graphic components that are just single colors. So if I switch this back to AA, that's now passing because it's 5.4 to 1. But if I hit AAA, I need to split these out to hit 7 in order to get that to pass. So that way you can at least check your text against your background color to make sure that you are meeting compliance. The other thing I want to show you, which might be a useful tool for you, but I'm not sure it's going to translate correctly, is the color filters in your computer itself. So in Windows settings, in the Ease Access menu, we can go down to color filters, and we can turn these on. Inverted, I think, is the one I would recommend the most to people because that is the most drastic, and it is also the one that people with like diabetic retinopathy will sometimes use, or other people with other kinds of low vision will use inverted because it makes these very stark contrasts. The reason I bring this one up is because there are a number of times when we're looking through something and like this border will disappear because it's gray on white or gray on black. It doesn't on this website, but I've seen that happen plenty of other places. So it's a useful tool just for quickly visually checking your work to make sure that nothing just disappears into the background. I hope that translated correctly. I'm not always sure because sometimes these kind of settings only show on like your monitor or something. It doesn't show actually like when you're sharing screen, but in our event, you can try that out for yourself. Mac OS does have this available as well. It's in their accessibility menu under vision and I think color. So it's available on both kinds of machines. If any of you are using Linux, I unfortunately have no experience with Linux, so I would recommend just looking through the settings, but I'm 90% sure that you have some kind of tool available to you in that regard. All right, image guidelines, things we need to consider. As per any accessibility presentation ever, always add alt text to non-text content. The other point here, though, is you can mark elements as decorative or artifacts. So a screen reader can ignore them. That's mostly used for things that are like just purely decorative, like a divider line or a separator to try and pull people's attention away from things or pull it into a certain order. You can mark those as decorative because they're not going to mean anything to someone who's using a screen reader. It's also useful later on when we talk about charts and data because it might be something where we have to make the actual chart an artifact, but then make sure all the data points are separate to be readable. Any complex images or vectors that you're using, try and flatten them into a single layer. Or sometimes you have to export them in order to make them function as a single object. The reason I say that is because when you're remediating the document, or if you're doing any work in Acrobat Pro afterwards, there are occasions where things will like fall back in the layer order because as you're tagging them, for whatever reason, Adobe isn't interpreting it correctly or is interpreting it in a different manner. And that sometimes causes images to pull apart if they're these kind of vectors or layered images. If you have like a color bar at the top that has like a shadow effect on it or something, and then like a text on it, and the text falls behind it, when you pull the text forward or something, it causes the shadow to pull out of the image or disappear. And these are the kind of things that are a problem to deal with after the fact. So the more simple you can make it before you send it out, the easier it is to make it accessible. If possible, trying to avoid those overlapping elements or combine them into a single element. And that is something sometimes we do as a workaround is we have that text on like a color bar or something. And for whatever reason, we can't tag the text. So we take that whole piece, both the bar and the text, and tell Adobe to interpret it as an image. And then we just put the text in the alt text. That gives us a way to get that information to screen reader users and not have to deal with that mess of making sure the layers are in the right order while maintaining that reading order, because for whatever reason in Adobe, sometimes they interfere with each other. And then also finally, Adobe themselves recommend that you anchor images in the reading order, especially in InDesign, because that way you can avoid it floating off in the reading order to where you not want it to be, or you can make sure it's deliberately attached to the context you want it to be with. If you're using Microsoft products or whatever, they recommend also avoid using out of line wrapping, because that causes that image to either be above the content in the reading order or after everything else in the reading order, or sometimes splitting paragraphs depending on where it's floating. So the more you can put it in line with the text and connect it to these kind of things, the more you can determine how someone is going to read your document. Because we want to make sure that people are interpreting this the way you want them to. I apologize, I need a drink. On screen, I have a couple screenshots of the alt text menus for Acrobat Pro and InDesign. Acrobat Pro in the accessibility tool has a button saying set alternative text. When you press that or activate it, a dialog window pops up saying set alternative text. It'll run through all the images in your document, create a list out of them, and you can scroll through them and add alternative text for each one. It also has a checkbox for decorative figure, so you can mark an element as a decorative figure, and then a screen reader is going to ignore that element. In InDesign, it's actually called Object Export Options, because you'll be able to set alt text in the file itself, but then you also set it for a PDF or an EPUB or HTML document. So it gives us a little bit more flexibility in what we're sending these out to, but you can add alt text to all of these. Dealing with infographics and data visualization can be tricky because these are much more complex things with a lot of things people need to read, and also it's been historically a problem trying to translate charts and graphs into an accessible manner. So how do we approach this? First off is provide a summary of the important information. Sometimes this is done as a separate document, just as a text field elsewhere in the document, or even a separate document, a link to somewhere on a web page that they can get more information, or get like a table from that they can use instead. Sometimes it's even just providing a description in a separate file that you send alongside of this, but you don't want to add the whole explanation of everything into the alt text. The alt text of that particular chart or graphic should just be the title and like a one sentence summary of what it's supposed to be presenting. So it's more important that they have access to that information in another manner. Second point, this is something I will be showing later, is you can put data values into text fields so that they can be tagged separately from the chart or graph. This is especially useful when you're working like in Illustrator with data sets and you send it off to InDesign or Acrobat Pro, you can separate those out so that those can be tagged in red, but then the actual chart or graph is ignored. And that way, screen reader users are still getting all the information. They just will not have, they won't have to deal with that visual interpretation of that data. In those cases, though, still make sure to have that kind of summary paragraph below it, just so people are understanding why are you showing them this data and what does it actually mean. That's just general good practice anyway when dealing with this kind of material, though. And third point is color should not be your only method of providing meaning. So in the case of like a chart or graph, having those like color bars as your explanation of comparison for different things, you need to have some kind of either texture in the color or like arrows pointing into it or something, just something to visually connect data to a bar or a company or a legend or what have you outside of color, so that those who are colorblind still have that connection. That can be things like, making it, striped or something. It can be just putting the data value inside the bar or the name inside the bar, that kind of thing. Just have some method aside from color that associates that data with its other purpose or point. On screen, I have a tagged infographic example. So this is an example document I created in InDesign and then exported to Acrobat Pro to use for this. It's just a really super simple pie chart. I created in Illustrator and then put it in InDesign. And then Acrobat Pro, I'm looking at the reading order in the accessibility tool. So what this has done is the chart itself is in the center. It does not have this gray box around it with a number. All the other elements around it do have that gray box with a number, though. That is the reading order in Acrobat Pro. So in the example, this case here, the first data point is the sixth item on the page to be read, and its value, which is 26%, is the seventh item. Data point 2 is the eighth piece, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And then the reading order got messed up, so the heading is now point 14, but we can fix that, and I'll show you how later. And then you have the summary paragraph below that's read after all those data points. The actual chart itself isn't tagged, so that will be ignored by a screen reader. But because we've separated this out into those text fields and tagged those text fields, screen readers will still be able to read the data points and the summary and won't have to worry about not having the information or not being able to interpret it correctly. So this is kind of one of our ways around dealing with something, if presenting it visually, but making sure that we're still giving it in an accessible manner to those without vision. So the rest of the presentation is going to be mostly about the Adobe Design process. The reason I focus on it is because it's one of the main tools people are using in these fields. It's very popular for creating these kind of documents, and Adobe has quite a bit in its toolkit for making products accessible. There's still things that go wrong, and there's still certain things that don't have these tools, like Illustrator doesn't have a lot of what we're talking about, but it's going to be our main go-to point. If you're working in any other product or something, I would recommend looking through the help documents for that product or going to the makers of that product and seeing what they have that's their equivalent of these tools. If you're looking at Microsoft Office or what have you, I recommend going to our document accessibility webinar because a lot of the tools have been mentioned there already. So if you're starting off with Illustrator, this is where you're mostly dealing with things like graphics and color and vectors and images and such. So this is where you're going to concern yourself most with those contrast ratios, the color blind aspects, that kind of thing. Also making sure that anything you're creating here is now treated as separate elements so that when we go to tag them and such, they're going to be treated in the manner you want them to be, or they're going to be those single pieces. rather than, this multi-layered vector image that when Adobe looks at it or Acrobat Pro looks at it, it's going to try and tag it like 16 times because there's 20 layers. Trying to avoid that problem. InDesign is kind of our second step, or sometimes our first step. That's kind of where we get into the meat of this, because we can add those accessibility tags. We can determine the reading order in the articles panel or the structure panel. We can add alt text to our images. We can make sure to export that out. And then there is some ability to deal with document metadata there. Then finally, when we've exported that PDF in Acrobat Pro, we're able to finalize that document metadata, like the title, the description, and add any additional tags if needed. Double check that reading order, making sure it's reading properly, because sometimes things don't always translate correctly, like that heading in the example I just showed you, and be able to touch those up and finalize things before we fully publish it. So InDesign itself has a number of tools available to use. There's paragraph styles there. So you have the ability to create styles based on the looks you've made, and then apply that to other things. And it also applies those heading and paragraph tags that we want. The articles panel, where you can determine the reading order. There's also the structure panel, which is the tags panel. It looks the same as the one in Adobe Acrobat from our document webinar. Tagging objects in the context menu creates those tags in there as well. Image anchoring, you can do that in InDesign, where you'll be able to click and drag frames to each other in order to say, when you read this, also read this. And then if you're using any tables or what have you, making sure that you have header rows and correct tags in there when you create those. And then finally, any document title or descriptions. All right. So next I have a video. Oops. Here we go. So I'm going to play this video. I created this on another machine, and I'm just going through some of the basics of InDesign here and explaining how they, or what you're doing, how they work. This video itself is captioned. When I send out the slide deck to you all, this is an unlisted YouTube video, so it should still work. If you have problems with it after the fact and you want it, please let me know, and I'll see if I can get you the file so that you can have it at your leisure. Okay? On screen is an example document created using InDesign and Illustrator. We'll start with paragraph styles. First, we use an existing style and apply it to a later heading, and then we will create a new one. First heading, example document, is styled as a heading 1. It has a plus symbol next to the style name to show it has been modified since the original style was applied. Below, chart demonstration heading 2 was used to make the heading 2 style. The paragraph in between uses the basic paragraph style that is on by default. Scrolling down, there is text placed here meant to be headings, but is not yet. To change this, we can apply an existing style. By selecting the Paragraph Styles panel and clicking the Heading Level 2 paragraph style, this text is now set to be a heading. For the next heading, it's meant to be a Level 3 heading. We do not have an existing style to use, so we have to make one. First, set the desired look. Then select the text box and click Create New Style. This will create Paragraph Style 1. Double-clicking this option will open the Paragraph Styles menu. There are a number of options here for various formatting purposes, but we want to look at the last option in the list, Export Tagging. In this tab, we will change the name of the style to Heading 3 and change the tag for it in both EPUB, HTML, and PDF documents. Select the tag you want to use in both submenus, in this case, Heading 3. Now, let's tag the images. We'll start with the second image because we want the chart to be a background artifact. Select the MDTAP logo and go to the Objects menu. click the Object Export Options list item, and a new dialog will open. The first tab is where we'll enter alt text. It's currently filled in with custom alt text since the other options pull from other areas such as file metadata, which we don't have. Now the next tab will affect its text when exporting to a PDF. We'll leave it to use the tag from the structure of the document, but we'll switch the text source to custom and add the alt text again. This is to ensure proper labeling. Other helpful features are the auto tag and tag frame from the context menu. By auto tagging another frame initially, we can then tag other frames as the same thing or change their tags. Select in Structure opens the Structure sidebar, which should look the same as the one in Adobe Acrobat. Text is typically entered as story, and images are entered as images. It is recommended to make sure to tag everything in the structure so that it is properly exported to PDF. To mark something as a background element, we'll use the Object Exports Options menu again. This time, we'll select using the artifact tag, which will prevent it from being in the reading order. To anchor an image, click and drag the solid blue square on the top of the frame to another frame. This will place them together in the Articles panel. The Articles panel determines reading order. It can be opened from the window menu. To add a frame to it, either select the frame and click Add Selection to Articles, or drag the frame into the panel. The new article dialog will open where you can add the name of the panel. By default, Include when exporting is checked. It also gives an explanation of how the reading order is determined by the article order. Finally, when creating a table, make sure to add a header row. If a table is created without one, the Properties menu has a tab for adding header and footer rows. The header row is more important since that is a separate tag in the structure. So those are the tools you have in InDesign in order to make your product or your document more accessible. Couple points is once you've tagged something in InDesign, that auto tag thing goes away and you'll just see tag frame or untag frame. So just be aware of that. And then the last thing is that when you export to PDF, there'll be a checkbox on, or after you select where you're saving it and the file type, you'll see another dialog that gives you a bunch of other options for it. The two main ones you want to look at are a checkbox that says, tag or export as tagged PDF, which you want to click because otherwise you're wasting all this work. And then the second one is use structure to determine reading order. That works if you've not dealt with the article panel, but you've tagged everything and moved it around. Depending on which panel you've used, you can check that box or not. I do recommend, honestly, going through and making sure you tag everything and also putting in the articles panel just as a redundancy, because there are times when Adobe interprets it incorrectly, and that way you at least still have a working version in the other manner. So now I just want to quickly show everyone a couple things in Acrobat Pro before we close out the day. So here's that same document in Adobe and Acrobat Pro. All of this is how it came out of InDesign. So I didn't have to do all of this in Acrobat Pro. But just to make sure, I can open up the accessibility tool. I can click reading order. In my case, because I've also set it on the left side of my program as default, I can check the reading order over here. So in the case of like this heading, that is number 14 on the list and read after these data points, I can just select it and then click and drag it above the data points in order to move it up in the reading order. So now it's in the correct reading order. So that way, these kind of things, sometimes it just misinterprets it correctly, either due to layers or just due to how you entered it, if you entered it after the fact, or if you changed any tags. Like I think in this case, why that one just moved in the reading order is because I untagged it and then retagged it while creating this example. but you can go in and quickly check these things as well. And then finally, the other thing you can do here is just to make sure there's an accessibility checker built into Acrobat. You can run that. I recommend unchecking the create accessibility report because that'll export an HTML file for you on this. Since you're working just directly in this document, you don't need to do that. And it will mention these issues for you. So in this case, I haven't set the title or primary language. I can just right click this, click fix. I can now change this title to InDesign Access Demo, click OK. That's fixed that issue. So if there's anything up here that's appearing, you can go in and fix it. In the case of this, because InDesign has that single frame thing, this one I can actually kind of ignore because I have a reading order that's used. It's trying to treat a background as something. So that one I can either go in and try and tell it to ignore it, or I can just tell it, hey, fix it according to this. Color contrast and logical reading order are always going to say needs manual check. So that's why you want to do that before you send it to PDF, because you've already done that work because you use the Adobe Color Center tools or the tools you have in InDesign or some other tool that you might have. Just making sure that you've done those things ahead of time. All right, and back to something. Just some other tips. PDFs can also be edited in InDesign and Illustrator without loss of existing work. So if you've already put out a PDF and you just want to change it, or you find like a typo or something, you can just open up that particular page in InDesign and Illustrator, fix it, and it'll still maintain all of the work you've done. You don't have to redo all this work, with the exporting and retagging and what have you. You should be fine. An occasion, if you're like deleting something out, you might want to recheck the reading order because sometimes tags can remain even if they're empty. But if you're just fixing like a word or something, or you're just changing like a color block or something, you're probably fine to go in and edit that and just leave it as is. Any linked files, like if you're putting an Illustrator file into InDesign, that's usually going to require you going into Acrobat and tagging that manually. Because in InDesign, you can tag that frame, but if you put like a data set table from Illustrator into InDesign, you're not going to be able to tag all those individual parts of it. So honestly, exporting it and then importing it as a separate entity might be easier. One thing about data importing and such that has come up in my work is people who are like scripting out these big data sets to send into Illustrator from Excel or something and then put into InDesign. It's a very complex process, and I know they're using like Visual Basic or some other kind of coding. Look into see if that can also import tags or add accessibility tags to these things. I've been doing research on it. I haven't found anything conclusive yet, other than it might be possible because we're working with XML in those cases typically, and XML does have the capability of adding accessibility language like ARIA or even HTML tags to it. Or in the case of PDFs, you can add those PDF tags via XML. You just need to add the appropriate data behind it for Adobe to interpret. How you do that, I don't know. But I have been looking into it. So if someone else comes across it, please let me know. And then finally, experiment. Sometimes we can't make this work, and we need to come up with these workarounds. And just keeping in mind that it's more important to provide all the information there than to just use the exact element on screen. So in the case of like having to combine that text and that background into a single thing in order to treat it as an image so that I can add all text to it, sometimes we need to do that. I can't tag the individual texts. So instead I've tagged this other thing and added the same description to it so that a blind user still gets that information. Additional resources coming out. There's Adobe's Accessible PDF Guide is coming out. APA style the organization manages the APA style, has an article about typography that is very useful. There's also data visualization from digital.gov, which is helpful tips. It's primarily more in HTML, but it might be more useful to you. Last thing I just want to mention, and you will get this when I send out the slide deck, SAS is a data solutions software company. They had an interesting presentation a couple of years ago on this. It is one of their products, but they developed a method of providing data in a way that uses audio tones like a piano scale to indicate comparisons. It's a interesting thing that I would recommend you check out if you have the time. So with that, we have our contact information on screen. You can email us at mdod or mdod.nva@maryland.gov. You can visit our website, mdod.maryland.gov. We are also on YouTube, MDTAP video, or MDTAP video, or you can subscribe to our newsletter, and that link is also on our website. With that, I will go ahead and take questions. Let's see. Email if possible, or seminar with whatever you end up finding regarding XML and tags would be great. Curious. Sure thing. If I can find an answer to that question, I will make sure people know. And then I saw someone raise their hand, and it's gone. So whoever had raised their hand, if you still have a question, you can either raise it again and I can unmute you, or you can put your answer or your question in chat and I will try and address it. Thank you for the webinar. Will you email everyone the PowerPoint? Yes. So in a day or two, I am recording this webinar. These recordings take maybe a couple hours to process. So hopefully tomorrow morning, I will send out the link to the recording from YouTube, and I will also include the PowerPoint. So yes, you are getting this slide deck. You'll have all the links in it to use. I'll try and send you the other information listing as well in case you can't use the slide deck. So you will have it. You're welcome. I'm glad you all are enjoying it. Okay, you had your question was about the PowerPoint as well. Great. Where do we find the recording for the documentation webinar? That is on our YouTube page. If you give me just a moment, I will grab that link for you. Document accessibility. All right. Here we are. Okay, so there's the link to the document accessibility webinar. I will make sure to also include that in the record or in the email out to everyone in the recording, because I know things in the chat will disappear from you once the room closes. Yes, everyone will get a copy of the PowerPoint along with the recording. I will just email the whole registration list and make sure everyone gets it. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I will be stopping our recording here.